So I'm joined by my colleague Kent. We're here to talk about a topic that is as important as it is confusing, which is marketing ROI. And we're going to go through some of the challenges with measuring marketing ROI, and also provide you with a kind of a practical framework that pretty much any company can use to manage profitability and their ROI. So first, to get started, I'm not great at math, but this seems to be pretty easy math even for me. You have a return from your marketing efforts, and you divide it by the investments you made in marketing, and that is your ROI. So why is that not as easy as it looks?
Yeah, there's a few things that makes it more complicating than it seems. I think one of the main reasons is how challenging it is to actually measure the return. So in theory, it's super easy. You allocate resources and you try to measure the return from those resources, and that makes it easy to make these resource allocation decisions. But when you have to account for a lot of errors, and this return metric actually being pretty unreliable, there are a lot of things that can go wrong. And we want to have sort of when making these resource allocation decisions, we need to have a framework that allows for and takes into account this unreliability. So we want to have a framework that's not reliant on you being able to perfectly measure this sales growth, this return on investment, while also allowing for. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that I think that's such an important point, because this term ROI is thrown around a lot. Or similar metrics like a return on ad spend, ROAS, without actually thinking about what it means. The R part actually is very difficult to calculate, and so it's often misunderstood, and we just look at revenue and sales, revenue and cost, as opposed to actually thinking about incrementality, which is key for this return.
Exactly. So that would be the main challenge with actually measuring the return, is that it's actually super challenging to measure the actual causal effect of advertising. Meaning, yes, we can measure if someone saw an ad and then bought, but that's not the same thing as measuring if the purchase, for example, was actually caused by the actual advertising. So there are a lot of things with measuring that. And then on top of that, you have a lot of things, a lot of challenges with tracking even that correlation. So just tracking if someone saw an ad and then purchased, that in itself is pretty challenging.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the primary challenge with measuring ROI.
Yeah, and we have some examples here from some actual company data, and this is not our data, but from our data from a client. So as you can see here, there's a if you look at the kind of big picture, I think this is 2 years worth of data. You can see there's a clear upward trend in sales, so revenue growth clearly, but also a lot of volatility for a lot of different reasons. So being able to establish a baseline that we can compare the sales growth with is next to impossible in this case. Very, very difficult to do. And very few companies have this kind of extensive historic data. And another thing is that when you look at marketing and the effects of marketing, we have short-term effects, sales activation, and long-term effects, branding effect, or like the result of branding. And sales activations are kind of easy to measure. So here are two examples of campaigns that were done that resulted in revenue growth, immediate revenue. But how do we account for the long-term effects that we know marketing has if done properly? That's a much more challenging, tricky thing to do. And so that's also maybe one reason why some of the companies that want to be marketing that claims to be data-driven also tends to be quite short-term, because that's the things that you can actually measure.
Yeah, exactly. And it's important to note that trying to optimize towards measuring the impact differs from actually optimizing for results. If you want to, if you go really hard on actually having to measure the results of your ads, and your marketing, then you sort of start to go more and more towards the things, the campaigns that mainly drive short-term revenue. And according to some studies, the long-term effect is actually dominates, meaning that the long-term effect of your marketing, which is even harder to measure, actually is larger. So you don't want to be too focused on the short term and also measuring the impact, but rather you want to, using judgment and experience and expertise, you want to balance the two, so to make sure that you also get that long-term effect. When you get and with that you get that increasing trend over time.
Exactly. So yeah, that's a good point. So this client has been doing branding, continuous, always on marketing throughout this period and preceding it as well. So what you see here is just some of those revenue spikes, but the long-term trend upwards is driven in part by this investment. So we have this conundrum, or I hope we've made a good enough case for the fact that ROI is thrown around a lot, it's used a lot, but it's actually very difficult to measure. At the same time, it's incredibly important to do so, to have a sense of, is our marketing actually generating investments, both from a cash flow point of view, but also from just an ability to be able to continue making those investments. You're probably going to get some pushback from your CFO, your CEO, or board if you're just you just say the ROI is impossible to measure, so we're not even going to try. But trust me, we'll just keep on spending. That might be difficult to sell.
Exactly, and what we're sort of trying to achieve here with any framework is that we want to be able to make resource allocation decisions, meaning we want to have a framework that allows for increases and decreases in marketing budgets, for example, without having to have reliable and super accurate measurement for that return. So that's what we're trying to achieve here. One thing that I could add with ROI, a small but important point, is that ROI is not what we're actually looking to maximize, meaning an ROI of 8 is not necessarily better than an ROI of 3, since what we're looking for is to maximize the amount of dollars or euros. So an ROI of 3 might be better at a much higher volume, at a much higher scale, since it brings in more profit dollars than an ROI of 8, for example.
Exactly. And so one also another thing with the high ROI is it can be actually a sign that something is not working, because it can be a sign of not driving incremental revenue, because the ROI on incremental revenue is going to be lower. So anyway, that's a different conversation. So the framework, kind of the alternative approach that can overcome some of these problems with ROI from an indirect point of view, is what we call like MER/CAC approach. So MER, marketing efficiency ratio, is something that every single company can calculate, which makes it very useful. So you just take your total revenue and you divide it by your total marketing costs for whatever period, monthly or quarterly or annually, or whatever period you're looking at. So what is the point of tracking MER? Or how does that help with, as you said, resource allocation and decision making?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, the first thing to understand is that MER does not imply performance, in the sense that just because what it's trying to measure is how much of the revenue are we spending on advertising. So it's only measuring the relationship between the level of ad spend and the level of revenue. So it does not say anything about what specific channels are working, or even if something is working, but it ensures that everything makes sense on a high level, meaning that we can make, regardless of the sort of resource allocation decisions we make, for example, in specific advertising channels, we make sure that it doesn't break the bank. It makes sure that we're profitable. it sets the limit on how on the percentage of revenue we can spend on advertising. So regardless of what other criteria we use for increasing and decreasing the budgets, we make sure that everything makes sense on a P&L level.
Exactly. And so kind of how you could very concretely use this is to, first of all, start measuring your MER. So you have some historic, and you can, this is all backward looking as well. So you can, even if you haven't measured anything like this, you have the data, you can easily do the calculations. Coming up with a MER limit or a floor for your business, it's going to be business specific, but based on historic data, it's quite easy to come up with a reasonable limit. And then you can use that as a guide to basically when it comes to marketing, to resourcing and budgeting, right? So if you've set the limit, and what you see when you start increasing the spend, increasing the investment, if your MER stays above that limit, then exactly as Ken said, that doesn't tell you about any specific channel or activity and their performance, but it tells you that good things are probably happening. Like you're able to actually drive incremental revenue. Presumably, there's always going to be external factors that impact, but so it can be a very simple framework that you can use for actually figuring out when you should increase or decrease your marketing investments.
Yeah, exactly. And one added benefit of this framework is that you don't have to make the decision again and again. You can update the limits, and you should, based on how what happens in practice. But this removes the need for having budget discussions every week and having to make those decisions again and again. Instead, this framework allows for dynamic budget allocations. You can pretty freely change the budgets according to this framework.
Exactly. And one kind of caveat to add is there are businesses where you need to look at MER on an annual basis. So a classic example would be e-commerce, where a large part of the revenue is going to happen in Q4. So with some clients, we could be at like a below even break even MER for 9 months out of the year. And then for the last 3, we know we're going to make up. But still, that means we have different MER targets for different seasons, but the same thinking applies. And just to also add one obvious point, which is you can also use cost of sale. That's kind of like the just inverse to MER here. And just one final point, MER is not the same as ROI. As Kent already mentioned, this does not say that the revenue that we're generating is a direct result of the marketing. It's just looking at the relationship and making sure that the overall P&L profitability is where we need it to be.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes people use, for example, like total ROAS or blended ROAS. We prefer using MER since it does not imply causality there. So it's not saying that all this revenue is caused by advertising, which it obviously isn't. In most cases, there are revenue that would happen regardless of marketing. So this is why we like to use MER instead.
Yeah. So then we have the other side of this framework, which is the customer acquisition, CAC, customer acquisition cost part. And that is, very simple math. You take your total marketing cost expenditures, you divide it by the total number of new customers acquired during this period. So this is, the math is very easy to do, but obviously it requires access to first-party customer data. So if you're selling through retailers, then you're going to have to figure out some other way of calculating this. But a lot of companies will be able to do this calculation quite easily. So Kent, what is the benefit of the customer acquisition cost, and how does it complement or supplement the MER equation?
Yeah. So the premise here is that the way you actually increase revenue, at least over the long term, is to generate new customers. So yes, there is revenue to be incremental revenue even to be generated from returning on existing customers, but only to a point. The way to win over the long term is to generate new customers. So this is a hugely important metric that we always look at. Again, like Joshua said, sometimes there are tracking challenges, but it doesn't necessarily have to be 100% accurate, and it won't be. But as long as you have some directionally accurate metric of new customers you can look at, this can be used. So the idea is that these, the MER limit and the CAC limit in practice they complement each other. So when MER is increasing, the CAC is also decreasing. Did I say that correctly?
Yeah, but yeah.
In theory. So the way this works is that you have sort of these guardrails within which you can freely adjust the budget according to what works. So you can spend up until your MER limit, and you can spend up until your CAC limit as well. And within that range, assuming you set your limits in a thoughtful way based on previous performance and what actually is profitable and not profitable to you, as long as you're within these limits, regardless, even if you can't measure the actual impact of your advertising, you're moving in the right direction. So again, the beauty of this framework is that it kind of ignores all the issues with tracking, which are getting more and more challenging with new privacy updates and so on and so forth. And it also ignores the issue with incrementality, which is even harder to actually measure. And it, again, lets you make fast, quick budget decisions without relying on those unreliable metrics.
Yeah, and so as Ken mentioned, this surpasses or like circumvents a lot of the issues. But what we're not saying is that you should only look at MER and CAC, look at blended CAC. We're saying that's a good place to start. And if that makes sense, then you can use all the attribution, all the qualitative customer data that you're collecting to figure out exactly which channels and tools and whatever you're using campaigns are actually driving the results. But this is a good place to start. And as I said, if you're able to keep CAC below the limit and increase spend at the same time, good things are happening. That's just a fact. And we actually use this exact approach with clients. And it's, as Kent mentioned, when it comes to budgeting decisions, this allows you to not even have to have those kind of conversations because you have a framework in place where we've had a clear CAC limit that the team is aware of on a daily or weekly basis, whatever it is, and given the freedom to increase spend, to maximize spend as long as they stay within that limit. So it gives a lot of freedom. It creates an opportunity to not just arbitrarily allocate the resources over the entire 12 months of the year, but rather if there's, for whatever reason, advertising costs, acquisition costs are lower, you really ramp up the spend and you capture all of that demand. And if for whatever reason, again, the opposite is true, then you lower your spend and kind of write it out. So it allows you to be very flexible. I think if you have properly set limits, which of course that's another whole other topic of what's a good CAC limit, but if you have properly set limits, that can really align the entire organization and give freedom to the marketing team to just go out and generate growth, which is ultimately what they're tasked with doing. So these two frameworks in combination, very simple and easy to use, easy for everyone to understand, and incredibly powerful.
Like Joshua said, in practice we use a lot of other signals to either be maybe closer to or further from the limits. So for example, if we see really bad signs within specific ad channels, we might pull the spend back a bit. But this allows you to, when we see good signals, we can then spend up until those limits, and we see, because everything makes sense on a high level.
Exactly. And so kind of in the beginning, we talked about ROI, and what we presented here is actually not about ROI at all, not at least in the real sense of the word. So this neither one of these tell us directly the ROI of our efforts, and most also equally importantly, it doesn't tell us what's working if we're doing a bunch of different things, which is quite common. But this framework does give us kind of a sense of the overall performance, the overall direction we're heading in, and how we should respond. And that's the usefulness of it. It's not perfect. It's not it's not pure, it's not perfect, but it is actionable, it's practical, it can be used. So that's why kind of it's something that we recommend, and it's a low cost, no cost thing that companies can implement. Pretty much all companies can implement, and really, I think, again, with properly placed limits, it can really unlock a lot of opportunities for profitable growth. Yeah, anything else to add?
There are a lot of things related to ROI and measuring success and things like that we could add. I think we're touching on topics that are discussed a lot. There are a lot of things happening. We have a lot of things to say, but this simple framework sort of ignores all the complicated stuff and lets you, basically anyone, have a starting point where they can they can do most things, the big things right, and then they can start looking at smaller things, which are also important. But the beauty of this framework is how practical it is, and how basically anyone can use it. So
well said. Okay, I think we'll wrap it up there. Just over 20 minutes. I think that's enough. I don't want to hear any more talk about this. But yeah, super important topic. Thanks again for joining me to talk about it. We might do future videos related, answering some future videos on answering some of the questions that this poses, about the long-term effects and et cetera. Yeah, thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you in a future video.
Thank you.